When I was compiling quotes for a series of healthcare articles that we ran in Freedom Daily, most of those quotes came from articles that had appeared in the Freeman magazine published in the 1950s. And in those articles, the authors, writing from a free market perspective, of course, were talking about the healthcare threat that was coming from the leftists, those that were trying to use government to take over the healthcare system, to manage and control this vitally important part of our lives. This was back in the 1950s. Again, the essays appeared in the 60s, then again in the 70s. So anyone that thinks that this assault is dead had better place things in perspective. The battle will continue. And we were fortunate to have Dr. Szasz, a hero not only for libertarians, but also for those in the psychiatry profession, address us tonight on healthcare, the latest excuse for the Leviathan. Dr. Szasz.
Mr. Hornberger, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for this extremely generous introduction. It is my honor and my pleasure to be here, and I thank you for asking me to perform this service, this honor. I will forego the obligatory humor at the beginning, but not quite. Much of what I will say is actually will illustrate a remark that Will Rogers made. Will Rogers said, I don't have to make any jokes every time Congress passes a law, it's a joke. And some of the things which I will be mentioning to you will be the kind of legislation to which this applies. Also, I might say that after having the pleasure of hearing Joe Sobrand's address at lunch, it occurred to me to say, with all modesty, that this is really a footnote. What I'm going to tell you is a footnote to the general theme that he has outlined, and which has also intrigued me, that really we don't have the kind of constitutional government that the founders dreamed of, but instead we have a different kind of government, and in some ways what kind of government we have is what I will be talking about. Now this year also happens to be the 50th anniversary of the publication of Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And it seemed to me that I would get started with that watershed. And between the publication of that book and the unraveling of the Soviet Union, we have now come to a situation which was in some ways always true in this country, but it is now quite obvious that no respectable individual defends socialism or communism as an effective economic policy. No one will say, as whoever it was, Brezhnev, that we will overtake you, we will have better consumer economy than you do. No one says that. But in point of fact, in the United States, going quite far back for reasons which are historical and cultural and perhaps unknowable, the word socialism has early acquired a negative connotation. So there are very few people who call themselves socialists, much less communists. But they don't have to. Because in this country, the notion of protection, particularly protection from destitution and disease, has really replaced the need for socialism. And as I see it, really, the whole health care rhetoric is socialist rhetoric in terms of disease treatment and so forth. Now, I'll be obviously saying much more about that. Now, when we talk about the government taking a role in protecting people from disease, the first thing I want to mention that the very concept of disease is not as simple as it may seem, and its meaning has changed. Now, what is a disease? You might all think you know what a disease is, and of course you do, but you don't. because those of you who think of this in a kind of a personal and down-to-earth way, mainly about yourself, will think that a disease is something, first of all, that you don't want. You rather have be without. Secondly, that it is something that happens to you. Something like leukemia, or diabetes, or arthritis. I mean, this is not something that you want. And fourthly, it is something which one can genuinely, philosophically say is not a part of you. In other words, if you have, let's say, tuberculosis or you have a sore throat, now, or for this week, next week, when you haven't got it, you will still be you. It's not a part of you. Now, this is in some ways, the last but not least, there is a scientific dimension of it, which is very important, and which again, you don't have to be a physician or in any way a professional person to realize that modern medicine is relatively recent, going really only back to about the second half of the 19th century, and depends really on the development of modern medical technology, mainly the autopsy, tissue staining, pathology, and then the more sophisticated techniques of examining the body. So that I have always thought that the analogy between the gold standard in economic affairs and pathological lesions in medicine make a very nice analogy. That is, diseases are not something that doctors make up. It is something that they find, and they typically found it in dead bodies. And how do you know that somebody has a disease, that somebody dies, and the pathologist examines the liver, the kidney, the lungs, and so on, and they find if someone has pulmonary tuberculosis, that their lung looks different from a normal lung, and so on. It's that simple. And sometimes, of course, there are new diseases, like AIDS, Legionnaires, and so on, but these are all found by pathologists on people who are, quote, sick in some ways. But the clinical diagnosis is always secondary, is always trumped by the pathological diagnosis, as it's said in medicine. Now, this was pretty much the case until, certainly even when I went to medical school, which was more than 50 years ago. But this has changed really since then quite rapidly. This was, first of all, not always true. And as I said, I'm not going to be saying much. This was never true of psychiatry, because psychiatrists always were the medical specialists who treated diseases which did not exist, in the sense that pathologists never saw them. Pathologists, going back to psychiatry, pathologists never saw madness. They had pathologists in mental hospitals. They kept looking for diseases. And every once in a while, they did find the diseases historically, the most important example being neurosyphilis. Now, neurosyphilis, as you know, is a pretty bad thing. And if you have neurosyphilis, after a while, you don't act normally, quote, so that causes madness. And when, of course, the pathologists found this, then this became, quote, a disease. Now, one of the things which happens, and I just want to get this out of the way, is that when a pathologist finds a disease, it's no longer a mental disease. Then it's a real disease. It's a brain disease. And neurosyphilis still exists. It's very rare now, after this of penicillin, but it still exists. But psychiatrists have nothing to do with it. If somebody has neurosyphilis now, it's treated by neurologists or specialists in infectious diseases with antibiotics. It's not a psychiatric disease. Now, the reason why this is important is because from a psychiatric basis, with which you are more or less familiar, in our day we have developed to a point where diseases are no longer defined by pathologists, but are defined essentially by a political process. And I will illustrate that as I go on, of which, generally speaking, diseases are things which are unwanted behaviors. Now, who are they unwanted by? They may be unwanted by the individual himself, in which case he or she may call it a disease, or they may be unwanted by psychiatrists, or most typically by society, the authorities of the state. Of which the best example, of course, is, quote, drug abuse, substance abuse. Now, the important thing, well, I'll come back to that. Now, one more thing about disease. The entire healthcare debate is premised on an idea which is a wonderful idea, a very simple idea. There's only one thing wrong with it. It is totally fallacious. Now let me tell you what that idea is, and I never see this mentioned. Again, it is something which when I tell you, you will say, well, of course. But I never see this mentioned, and it is absolutely crucial. Now the premise is that diseases require treatment. So the thing to do is avoid diseases so you don't need the treatment, which will then cost a lot of money to everybody, because obviously nobody pays for it anymore. You know, you pay for everybody else's disease except your own disease. So the thing to do is to prevent diseases. Sounds all right? No. Diseases don't require treatment. Diseases, that's why I define them, diseases are natural events, like oil in the ground. It's a phenomenon. Cancer of the colon. Now, oil in the ground doesn't need extracting. People want it extracted, assuming they have some use for it. So diseases don't require treatment. Some people want their diseases treated. Okay? And some people don't want their diseases treated. Now you hear about how people shouldn't smoke, for example. I'll come back to that. Because it will cost a great deal of money to treat it. Therefore, if you get lung cancer, I will have to pay for it, so you shouldn't smoke. Well, this has a certain rationale to it, given this socialist premise. There's only one thing wrong with it. There are all kinds of people with all kinds of diseases who don't want treatment. The relationship between disease and treatment is arbitrary, is not logically if one then the other. A lot of people with diseases want treatment. A lot of people without any diseases want treatment. It used to be called hypochondriasis. Conversely, a lot of people with diseases don't want treatment. Now, who are some of the people with diseases who don't want treatment? Well, there are two huge groups. I could spend maybe, you know, we are gaining an hour tonight, so maybe I should spend that extra hour talking to you. But one large group are called Christian Scientists. Now, when you hear about smokers being penalized for causing extra healthcare costs, do you ever hear about Christian Scientists being exempted from certain taxes? Because they don't utilize healthcare costs at all. Right? You're a Christian Scientist, it doesn't cost you anything. Taxpayer doesn't cost anything. Now, the other group, and I will perhaps say more about that, are so-called crazy people. Now, they don't, their cost, their healthcare cost is astronomical, as things now stand. But in point of fact, they have a characteristic. And that is they don't want any treatment at all. I am talking about really mad people. When I talk about psychiatry, by the way, I should clarify it. I'm not talking about psychoanalysis, counseling. To me, psychiatry is one of two things, which is the way it was born and which is its backbone. It is locking up innocent people, called civil commitment, and excusing guilty people, called the insanity defense. That's what psychiatry is. In both cases, nowadays, generally you get locked up. Keep in mind someone like Hinckley. Hinckley did not say, I was sick. Hinckley wanted to plead guilty. Other people said he is sick. They are still treating him. They are working on his schizophrenia. Now you see, if you believe that, you'll believe anything. But nobody believes that. I think modern societies, especially this country, run on hypocrisy. Nobody believes any of this. Nobody believes that the war on drug works and so on, but there are reasons why this goes on. Now, the other group of people are, quotes, crazy people, who in current parlance, Tipper Gore parlance, suffer from denial. They are in denial. Now, what does that mean in denial? Denial means I don't want to see a doctor. Well, you would have thought this is a constitutional right. You don't have to see anybody you don't want to see. But no, if you don't want to see a doctor, then you certainly have to see a doctor. And that's going to be very expensive. So there are two ways in which healthcare costs are incurred, that you are asking for it, or that somebody else says you have to get some healthcare. And that's then going to cost money. Now, I prepared a fairly elaborate paper, but everybody tells me that I shouldn't read a paper. So I'm not going to do that, but I do have some quotes